Constructed response questions. So what are they? Short answer questions, essays, oral presentations, practical demonstrations, all those sorts of things where students are not cued. They don't see the answers in front of them. They have to actually think about what the potential answers can be before they provide an answer themselves. Nominally, they test higher level cognitive skills. That's not always the case. They are nominally easier to write. Once again, that's not always the case. Your mileage will vary. Compared to selected response questions such as multiple choice questions, they are costly to mark. They take a lot of time to mark essays. Anyone who's done one will obviously know that. They have lower intermarker and intra-marker reliability. You could mark an essay and give it a distinction. Your colleague might mark it and give it a high distinction or a credit. You may actually mark the same essay 3 hours apart and give them different marks yourselves. They are inherently less reliable than selected response questions. They don't cover the breadth that short, punchy questions can deliver. So you have to be very, very careful about what you choose to assess using essays, reports, oral presentations, because they don't cover the breadth of content. They do, however, potentially give you greater chance to assess the depth of understanding. And hopefully you assess things which have transferability to other areas, so you can make an informed decision about the skill level of the student overall. How do we mark them? Well, we often use rubrics. If you're not using rubrics, you should seriously consider using them. They make life a lot easier. They do reduce the inter and intra-marker reliability issues to some extent. They also provide guidance to both yourself, students, and other markers exactly as to what is of most value in the work that you've set them. How do we design these questions? Think about why you're asking the questions. What are the outcomes of the question going to tell us about the student? Are you assessing them at the appropriate level of Bloom's taxonomy? It's not a formula, it's just a matter of thinking about what you're asking and what the level of answer that's coming back from the student is likely to tell you about their skills. Think about the topics that you need to be assessed, how they relate to the learning objectives and the learning outcomes. Really critical to make sure that these things are very well aligned, particularly with constructed response questions where you don't have the opportunity to ask 100 questions to try and get your feel for the student. You've got one go, maybe two. Rubrics should be shared amongst everyone who's involved in the assessment process. The student should know what they're being assessed and how they're being assessed. The markers should understand what is being valued here by you, the coordinator or the course program runner, and they should all see it beforehand. With the markers, it's definitely worth discussing the rubric and talking about how you might get some consistency across the board there. Examples. So online we can actually set up some very basic constructed response questions. Selected response are much easier. They are the the feature set of most learning management systems. With constructed response questions, it's less. So here's one, fill in the blanks. Don't have too many blanks to fill in and don't make them too difficult. One ring to rule them all, one ring to bind them, but that's too many blanks in the one sentence. So you can have item writing flaws in constructed response questions as well. You might provide a text with errors in it and get the students to identify and correct each errors. These are relatively simple examples, but progressively getting a little bit more difficult. This is what will be considered to be a short answer question. There's not too much that's going on here for the students. They just have to think about what the possible answers are and discuss very briefly, the marks giving them some sort of guidance about how much time they need to spend on this. You would not provide a rubric for something like this. You'll consider providing a marking scheme. So if you're not marking it, or if you are marking it and you've got other people marking it as well, that there's a clear understanding of where the marks are allocated. It's important also to think about whether you need a short answer question like this or whether you can replace it with a better written multiple choice question, because obviously you can't automate the marking of the short answer questions with any great ease. So you might provide a brief guideline as to where marks can be gained for this short answer question. Online, you would probably consider providing no marking. You might give this allocation scheme, this is where the marks would have gone, and then provide an ideal answer for the students so that you don't actually have to mark, and there's some automated and instant feedback for the students after they've completed the short answer question. A more longer question, this might be a few hundred-word essay, you might choose to provide a rubric with this, or you might choose to provide a template of marking like before. It will depend on the length and also your own personal preferences. Try and avoid choices within questions, particularly where there may be a disadvantage to one group of students or another. There's two questions here. One is relatively complex. It's not a completely straightforward answer to this. The other one is probably a little more straightforward. Potentially it's a very linear question discussing events, and my guess would be that if you're going to mark this one, you'll probably assess 20 different types of events that happened over that period, and as long as the students hit the mark on most of those, they will get a mark for it. The previous question might be more challenging. So there's an imbalance there depending on which ones the students answer. Your better students probably should be answering this question here, the top one, but they may be disadvantaged by doing so. Think about choice. Think about the wording you use. This is obviously an outrageously silly question, and can be reworded very, very simply. There is no advantage in being clever with your wording when the students can potentially be disadvantaged by it, particularly students with a lesser grasp of English. Don't have item writing flaws in your constructed response questions either. The story of the three little pigs says, many characters, identify three characters in the story, tell what each made their house out of. The assumption here is that you're going to discuss one of the pigs, but there's a big bad wolf in here somewhere. And this potential flaw could confuse some of the better students. A better way of putting it, choose a character, describe some of the traits of the character, and then explain how their behaviour is governed by some of those traits. Simple example. Here's something from law. This is obviously a very dense question, but potentially needs to be dense to a point. However, there's some unnecessary information in here. Please do so using paper supplied, employing one of the computers in the classroom. Your response to this will count for. There's a lot of stuff here which is actually not part of the question and is distracting for the students and distracts and detracts from the actual question that you want to ask. So Popham talks about some guidelines for constructed response questions. We'll leave them up there. Typically, make sure that the items that you set up have brief, unique responses and have direct questions for short answer questions. Make sure that with your essays and longer constructed response items that the student's task is really, really clear. Make sure that the length of the assignment is clearly transmitted to the students, and think about using more short answer questions rather than long answer questions. Don't employ optional questions. We talked about that a little while ago. And try and test some of your questions out on your colleagues. They don't actually have to sit down and write a 1,500-word essay, but they can talk about what they would actually choose to write based on the question that you've set. And you'll get some information there about some of the validity of the question that you're asking. And speaking of validity, reliability, and measuring the quality of your assessments, that's something that we will talk about next time.